the wickedest man in the world, a cannibal at large, king of depravity. These are just a few of the titles given to Aleister Crowley, infamous writer and poet who became a kind of spiritual guru in the first half of the 20th century. He reportedly held black masses, many of which involved sexual orgies and blood drinking, and he had a harem of women followers whom he dubbed Scarlet Women. But was Crowley truly doing the devil's bidding, or was he just a seeker of philosophical and spiritual knowledge? This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode number 14, and this episode continues our series surrounding the occult. This is the second episode on this topic, so it may help to go back and listen to the episodes in order. All right, so for this episode, we're going to be talking about Aleister Crowley and magical societies. So his particular society, Society of the Inner Light. We may even talk about theosophy a little bit in this episode. But Lisa, why don't you kick us off some background information about Aleister Crowley and magic?
Well, first, I have to say I am almost giddy at the fact that we're getting to talk about Aleister Crowley. He is absolutely one of my favorite occult figures, and he's probably one of the first ones that got me started on the path down learning about all of this occult. And I won't go too much into his background because I feel like out of all of the occult figures, he probably is one of the ones that is more famous, I guess more widely discussed. But I will say that he grew up in a very religious home. His parents were pretty strict in how they raised him, and they were strict in his moral education, I guess you could call it. So a lot of what followed in his life was probably a rebellion to that. It was a rebellion first to his parents, but also I think just in general to the Victorian repressive culture that he was raised in. At about age 23, he started really finding interest in occult matters, and that's when he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I'll just kind of put a pin there and back up a little bit. I read a story, which I'm not sure if it's apocryphal or if it actually happened, but I do like the story. Apparently, when he was a young teenager, he lost his virginity to a maid in his parents' house. It actually happened in his parents' bed, and his parents found out about it and fired the maid and dealt with him. But that, I think, one act of rebellion led to quite a bit of sexual experimentation with a young Aleister Crowley, which becomes important because when he joins up with the Order of the Golden Dawn, he met quite a few influential people, Arthur Waite, who we've talked about in previous episodes, and also William Butler Yeats. But these men did not care very much for him, and his sexual politics, Aleister Crowley's sexual politics, actually got him banned from the Golden Dawn. But what I really want to talk about, what I really find fascinating about him, is how he became kind of a villain in literature, specifically starting with William Butler Yeats. And his poem, The Second Coming, has that famous description of the Antichrist and the line that says, "And what rough beast, its hour come round at last." And a lot of people have said that knowing of their dislike for each other, that description of the beast is actually a fictionalized Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, Lisa, in one of the articles that you shared with me about Crowley, I thought some of the literary connections that he had were really fascinating. Playing off of that W.B. Yeats example, which we also talked about W.B. Yeats when we talked about Arthur Waite, because they were all three kind of involved, or four if you count the artist of the tarot cards, involved in the schism that happened ultimately to the Golden Dawn. But evidently, according to this article that I read, he might have been the basis for the evil alchemist Carswell and M.R. James's ghost story Casting the Runes, which makes me want to go back and revisit that story now. And some people have made the argument that he featured in Hemingway's Immovable Feast, and the article also referenced possibly running into Isherwood and Ian Fleming, because I think there was some implication of Crowley having done some spy work, right, when he was kind of traveling around.
Yeah, I think one of the stories is that when Fleming was working intelligence, he needed to lure a guy, I guess, so that he could talk to him. And this one guy was very much into the occult, and he thought, well, hey, I know this guy who is really into the occult as well. And so he thought that he could get his mark if he basically used Aleister Crowley as bait, basically. And that's exactly what he did. And apparently it worked. And so at least it's a story that's being told that Crowley had some part in a secret intelligence mission for Britain. But what I find more interesting than that even is that Fleming then, when he turned to write his James Bond books, the very first villain that you get in Casino Royale was apparently based on none other than Aleister Crowley. And that's one of the things that I find very fascinating. And, I'll back up a little bit and say that most of the stories I've read about Aleister Crowley are so absolutely outlandish and hard to verify. So I'm not sure how much of it is truth or how much of it is stories that other people have concocted, or maybe even that Aleister Crowley himself concocted when he was creating his religion later on. But I will say that he seems like a larger-than-life character, and I can very easily see why somebody who would brand himself as the Great Beast 666, how that could be a character that so many writers would look at and think, this has to be the template for my villain.
Right. I mean, you can only imagine the stories going around about this guy because, I mean, supposedly he is, as we talked in the intro, like the wickedest man in the world. And also there were stories of him participating in animal sacrifice. It's some of the stuff that I was looking at, and just these kind of exaggerated portrayals of him. I find myself wondering how he felt about this kind of infamy that he was getting, to the point where I think there was a stories I looked at, somebody claimed that a relative of theirs died during some sort of ceremony that Crowley may have been at because of drinking blood from a sacrifice. And it just seems so, I don't know. It's like something now we would think it's like something in a tabloid or something like that. That I think it's so funny how his life kind of, like you said, became bigger than maybe it was, and all these tall tales kind of grew out of him. He almost became a myth.
Yeah, he really was a man who grew into a myth. I think that's a perfect way of describing Crowley. But what is even more fascinating to me is how carefully he constructed that myth himself. That's something that is so fascinating to me because I agree with you, Mel. If we heard the story of Aleister Crowley today, I would almost assume that he was trying to start some sort of rock band and get the fanfare around it, because it does sound like tabloid fodder. But that this happened at the very turn of the 20th century, following all of these very stiff and staunch Victorian social norms and cultural values, makes it that much better to me, because you can imagine what it was that there was a man walking around calling himself the Antichrist, saying that he not only could perform magic, but perform sex magic. That was one of the things that he was very much interested in, not just the occult, but he was interested in, orgies, and there were these tall tales of naked women. And in fact, if any of you are as interested in Scientology as I am, there's even that connection to Scientology's leader, L. Ron Hubbard, who apparently at one point was involved in some of this before he decided to start his own religion. But I really think when you look at Crowley in particular and the religion that he wanted to start, his law of Thelema and his sexual magic, it almost just seems like somebody who very desperately wanted to rebel against the culture he was raised in. And he wanted to make a name for himself. I mean, so he constructed himself to be the ultimate villain.
Well, it's interesting that you kind of led off your comment or discussion just a minute ago saying that if he came around today that you'd think that he was trying to be a rock star. I mean, think about a very big rock star from the late 1990s, Marilyn Manson, who did practically the same thing. And I'm fairly certain that Aleister Crowley was a humongous inspiration on him. So just thought I'd throw that in there. Just ran a bit of 90s trivia there for you.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up, Matt, because as I was talking, that's actually the exact image that went through my head was of Marilyn Manson. And of course, most of the people know that, by the 1960s, Crowley kind of had, I guess there was reinvigorated interest in him with people, Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, the Beatles even. He became a different type of cult figure by the time the 60s rolled around. So I think it's very easy to walk across that bridge from Crowley's idea of religion to rock star cult status.
Absolutely. While we're going for random trivia facts, I just wanted to throw this out there because I had this pulled up. Yes, I use Wikipedia along with everything else for research, but I thought that this would be an interesting tidbit that, the Wikipedia entries for people will sometimes have a brief little like who they were, just kind of a digest in just a couple of words. And for Aleister Crowley, this is the order. It says Aleister Crowley, poet, mountaineer, occultist, in that order. So I just thought that it was funny that...
I feel like occultist should be first and then mountaineer and then poet. I'm sorry, but yeah.
Right.
I'm just wondering how mountaineer got thrown in there. I mean,
the guy was an adventurer.
I feel like the only thing that should be is occultist. I mean, yes, he was a poet, and there are quite a bit of his writings that are being collected out there now, and I haven't read enough of them to really judge. He certainly was in good company with other writers, so it doesn't surprise me at all that he wrote as much as he did. But I mean, when we say Aleister Crowley, who really thinks mountaineer?
Well, I was just thinking, going off of this idea of a counterculture figure and rock music and larger than life, that's I don't know. I was just thinking about the idea of magic, and magic is that, right? I mean, it's rebellious. It's trying to get power. It's a form of power, I guess. I hate to say like it's trying to get power per se. That's an interpretation on the person using it, I guess. But it's the idea that you can do what? You can change the world, like by doing a certain ceremony or a certain ritual or saying certain words, you access something that's greater than yourself and you can create something new. And I think that idea of rebelliousness and wanting to change things and being interested in artistry and ritual and myth and these sorts of things, like it sets him up perfectly to not only inspire a bunch of writers and myths about him, but also to kind of influence a counterculture movement of the 60s and on into rock music of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Because in some ways, I think, we talked about this with Shirley Jackson, like music and writing is a kind of magic, trying to affect the world around you. And it seems like the way he thought of it would lend itself for those kinds of movements.
I agree. And I actually even, you hear magic often described as some sort of like forbidden knowledge, the kind of things that are locked away in those hidden spell books and ancient tomes and all that sort of stuff, but partly because most of humanity shouldn't have access to them, but also because they're so esoteric or dangerous or whatever. So yeah, I think as far as a countercultural figure, I mean, it makes perfect sense that people starting in the 60s in this cultural revolution, so to speak, of exploring and the exploring the sexuality that hippies were known for as well, and sex and drugs and rock and roll all rolled up together. I mean, totally makes sense.
I mean, essentially, you guys have both really dug down to what the meaning of the occult is. Is that there is some sort of esoteric or hidden knowledge that people are seeking and that they want to uncover and give to everyone else. And I think that's what a person like Aleister Crowley himself would have said that he was trying to do. And that, I think, is what makes him such a fascinating figure, because it really is unclear whether or not, is this just a rebellious kid who enjoys the power of presenting himself in such a shocking way, or is he actually and honestly trying to uncover a new way of looking at the world? And I think that is something that, in particular, when you look at his views on sexuality, that's where it becomes a little bit of a gray area, because he not only would have these orgies with these beautiful women and have, his scarlet women around him, but he was openly bisexual. And in fact, that was what I think in particular got him in trouble with some of the members of the Golden Dawn. And especially in a time, I don't know if you want to call it post-Victorian, but when you have the trials of Oscar Wilde and everything, that was a very dangerous position to put him in. And so this is something that I don't think he took lightly. I think he took it very seriously, this search for knowledge and spiritual enlightenment, if you want to call it that.
Well, I think it's even possible that, he could be both. He could be both seeking power and seeking enlightenment. Not all enlightenment is self-abnegating. Some of it can be self-serving. So perhaps he was looking to bring this to other people, but also have that power for himself a bit, as well as being the head of this church or religion or whatever it is. So why not both?
Right. And maybe that comes down to his one law, which was, do what thou wilt.
Well, I guess what's interesting, too, is how, we talk about now right now it's early 2017, so it's kind of hard to, I think, split this apart, but I think part of his outcast and status and why people view him as this, evil person or whatever is the influence that he had on Anton LaVey, the head of the Church of Satan. That first law, do what thou wilt, pretty much is exactly what Anton LaVey preached, only he turned it into also, calling it Satanism. Although I think most Satanists would say that they're putting themselves up instead of thinking about others or something like that. But I don't know. I don't know enough about Satanism. So, but you can see if Crowley was an influence on Anton LaVey and it's got this, the Church of Satan, well, obviously that's evil in like 90% of the world's eyes. So clearly the guy that inspired the Church of Satan must also be evil. So I think, his reputation, we can't go back to the time that he was alive and talk about his reputation then. We have to work with what we've got now. So I think it might be kind of hard to extricate him from his influence on that as well.
Right. And his very oversimplifying, I guess, his law. But it does. It has that connection to, if you want to call it, the Church of Satan or Satanists today. But he is kind of the godfather of that movement, which, again, is probably more of a rejection of traditional religious values than it is actually a worship of any sort of demonic presence.
Going from Crowley to like the extreme of Satanism, it just seems like kind of interpretation of what he was trying to do. The stuff I read, it seems like he was more interested in kind of like staging a revolution against, like you were saying, more conservative cultural values of the time and post-Victorian age, into the Edwardian era, kind of saying, look, like wanting to buck all that repression, as he would have seen it. And then it's kind of like you take it to an extreme and then it becomes do what thou wilt, but maybe more of a worship of complete anarchy or Satan or however one would view it. I don't know. But it seems like Crowley was more into like a rebellion against what he saw as the conservative cultural values of the time.
I was going to say that's really interesting, because when you look at a figure like Aleister Crowley, what he was doing at the time was not that radical. It's just how he did it, because there were, these sort of magical, mystical, occult societies that were very popular during the era. We've already mentioned the Golden Dawn is just one of them, but they had a very strong reaction to what Crowley was doing, because some of the other ones almost look tame in comparison to the blood drinking and the orgies and the scarlet women and the calling yourself the Great Beast 666. They do seem like rather tame, tea drinking, sitting by a fire in the library philosophical societies in comparison. I guess one of the other societies that I'm thinking of that was certainly around the time of Aleister Crowley, is the Theosophical Society. Now, I don't know that much about the history of that society in particular, but Mel, I think you had said you'd done some reading into that.
I have, and I just want to warn people who might be experts in this. I do know that there were multiple Theosophical societies, because a lot of these groups would have splinter groups or branch off. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the founding of it and some of the ideas behind it before all the splitting went on. But some people trace our New Age movements of the 20th and 21st century back to Theosophy, because it also kind of went hand in hand with spiritualism, at least at the beginning, which was something that we talked about in our last episode. But the Theosophical Society originally formed in 1875 in New York, and it was co-founded by the famous medium and occultist Helena Blavatsky, which, if you know anything about Madame Blavatsky, you know that she had a very colorful life that involved being chased by a lot of debunkers claiming that she actually was not contacting anyone in her seances, that she was actually a fraud. In her beginning of the society, she claimed to have been contacted while she was traveling the world by what she called the masters of the ancient wisdom. And she claimed that these masters enhanced her psychic powers and told her to go to Tibet, where they would train her. And she went to Tibet and they trained her. Now, a lot of people claim that actually the whole time she was most likely chilling in Europe and not actually traveling all over the place and going to Tibet. But she traveled to America, set up shop as a medium, except she believed she wasn't talking to dead people. She believed that she was contacting beings on a higher spiritual plane. And her society, or this society that she formed with a couple other people, was kind of more global in nature and very welcoming of Eastern philosophies and spirituality. So they believed that the masters of the ancient wisdom basically needed the society as a kind of human framework to help people evolve to perfection, which then would unite all of us with our spiritual beings and put us into contact with our psychic sides, which we all would have. And so the original idea was that this would be a way to put science, philosophy, religions, and spirituality all in communication, which I thought was kind of interesting, because we haven't really talked about psychical societies yet, and I know that's probably a future episode, but we talked a little bit about spiritualism and its kind of relationship with science. And I just think theosophy in some ways plays into that same conflict that we see over and over again in the 19th century.
What I find really interesting about this particular society and Madame Blavatsky is how she kind of took this idea of Victorian spiritualism, but she was talking about this idea of like a higher spiritual plane, which does sound very almost like a Buddhist, or at least a very Eastern philosophical thought. And it reminds me of something you might encounter in a New Age religion today, where it is kind of this blending of different types of philosophies, of religions, just kind of taking a little bit from each and stirring it all in one big pot and coming up with something that's supposed to enlighten you and make you better. That's particularly interesting when you do compare it to somebody like Aleister Crowley and what he was doing, because everything that I have seen seems to be just a pure pushback against Western Christian values. But I don't know, maybe I'm just reading way too much into that.
No, I think I would agree with that. I feel like Crowley in some ways is more about rebellion and breaking the way things are and moving forward in some way, creating something new perhaps, and rebelling against what had come before. Whereas the Theosophical Society, I think it's trying in some ways to anticipate those psychical societies that worked more with science, but with a medium at the center of it that's difficult to do, with people claiming that she's a fraud anyway. But I do think there's more of an openness beyond just this kind of movement against what was. And also, you have to think, too, that there were And amongst all these different societies, whether they were spiritualist or magical, etc., there was a tendency at times to kind of compartmentalize their types of spirituality. So you would have groups that would kind of latch on to, say, esoteric Western forms of spirituality or the occult, and be kind of against or think that basically if you're a European or you're, well, just say white, that you don't have access to Eastern forms of spirituality. So they basically felt like each group of people had to kind of compartmentalize themselves into their esoteric mystery or lore. And the Theosophical Society seems to kind of go beyond that and try maybe to, like you said, if you're thinking of higher spiritual plane, it's more of a bridge. I mean, I don't know that they actually were doing that per se, but it seems to me in their language that they're trying to bridge those two communities rather than separating them as other groups seem to try to do.
This may take our discussion completely off topic, but I'm going to bring it up anyway because I found it very interesting. You know, we were talking earlier about Aleister Crowley and his connection to literature and how he was so often cast as the villain in so many famous pieces of literature. And when you're talking about the Theosophical Society, one of their more famous members, or at least somebody who had ties to them, was L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz. And there are tons of people, and if you're ever interested in it, you know, all you have to do is a quick Google search and find all the people on the internet. They'll gladly tell you how apparently he hid all sorts of messages in The Wizard of Oz. And, you know, when you think about it, I guess Dorothy does in some way access a higher plane when she goes through the tornado. But it is something that's really interesting when you start reading some of those accounts of how he was working through some of these beliefs, I guess, and in his literature.
Well, and if you look at lists of Theosophical members, there were a lot of writers, yet again, like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I think Yeats was involved at some point. Baum is often mentioned, as you pointed out. I think Doyle sometimes is mentioned. Writers like Algernon Blackwood. I want to say even Sir Henry Rider Haggard has been mentioned in passing associated with the Theosophical Society. And this was something that happened a lot of times. If people were interested in this sort of thing, they would be involved in numerous organizations. So it's not out of the question to have somebody who's with the Golden Dawn for a while and then move on to maybe a Theosophical Society, and then maybe even later be involved with people like Doyle with the psychical societies. And I do think, I don't know, this may go back to some of the stuff we talked about with, you know, writing as a form of creation and also what the spiritualists were doing as a form of creation and artistry. But there's a lot of fiction writers that join these societies and interact with these sorts of ideas. Writers and artists, musical artists as well.
Well, I don't know. Maybe you just answered this question, but I wonder what it was about these, and I struggle to call them occult societies because I don't think that they would necessarily accept that title. I mean, Aleister Crowley probably would, but, you know, these spiritual movements, I guess. I wonder what it was about them that attracted so many artists and writers.
Well, I think, people who are often pushing the boundaries of what's culturally acceptable tend to be the artists and the writers. Not that they're all doing things to just completely shatter cultural norms, but people, more often than not, they tend to be the artists and the writers, right? You mentioned Oscar Wilde.
Today, you don't hear about that many authors and artists who are involved in some sort of, fringe religious group, the same way that it seemed to happen back then.
I will just cut you off there and say Madonna, Kabbalah.
Yeah.
She was the most well-known, but in the early 2000s, that whole Jewish sect, the Kabbalah sect of Judaism got a lot of prominence when Madonna converted to it, and a lot of other celebrities jumped onto that bandwagon and were wearing that little red string around their wrist, and I don't know what else they did for Kabbalah because I don't know much about it. But, that was more of a fad, but, it does happen, I think.
No, I had not even thought about Kabbalah, but that fits right into this timeline of the occult and trying to unearth some sort of esoteric spiritual knowledge. So yeah, you got me there.
And if I remember correctly, isn't Kabbalah mostly like a numerological kind of thing where they're obsessed with numbers? I honestly don't remember much about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and in all this reading, and now everything's getting muddled in my head, and I'm going to have to go back maybe for our next episode and follow up on it. But I know that the Kabbalah and the teachings of the Kabbalah came up in one of these societies, at least one of them. So there was some sort of knowledge that it was, this ancient knowledge just waiting to be unearthed by, modern society. It may have been Aleister Crowley, but honestly, at this point, I couldn't say with any sort of certainty.
Isn't that the thing, though, with all these secret societies and magical societies and religious societies, is that they're just kind of reinventing the wheel? Because, they just take bits and pieces of religious ideas and spiritual ideas that are already there, and they're like, I'm rebelling against you, but then they put it together into their own kind of Frankenstein. The older, the better. It just seems like the same stuff just keeps kind of getting recycled. I mean, no disrespect to these societies, but... they just kind of keep recycling the same ideas, and then they get pissed off at each other and they splinter off into new groups, and then they try a new way with the old idea.
Yeah, Mel, I had that exact same thought when you were discussing Blavatsky and her beliefs, and especially when she was talking about that she would contact these beings that lived on a higher spiritual plane, but she was very clear that they were not dead people. And my first thought was, well, number one, how do you know? And
right.
Number two, really, what's the difference? If you're contacting these people that aren't on our plane and that are giving you some sort of special wisdom, I mean, really, you're kind of just splitting hairs at that point.
Well, I mean, I guess a spiritual being with special wisdom maybe never lived to die. Maybe a dead person is just a human who has no special knowledge. I don't know. I'm not even going to try to figure her out.
I mean, I'm going to say that I'm contacting aliens who live, actually they're dead aliens. It's my new thing. Dead spiritual beings. No, but it really does feel like each of these societies is just kind of taking bits and pieces, and they are recycling a lot of things. And a perfect example of that is the Society of the Inner Light, which, from what I can tell, is very similar to the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about the Society of the Inner Light, which I think also kind of melds well with our discussion about writers joining occult societies too. But disclaimer, I may be mispronouncing her name, but Dion Fortune was one of the founder, basically, the Society of the Inner Light. They went through different, I think at one point they were the Community of the Inner Light, and then they changed. But she also was involved with a branch of the Theosophical Society, but it actually wasn't Christian enough for her. So she decided to start her own group. But before even though when she was a child, I think she had hidden, memories of Atlantis or something like that kind of clued her into the fact that she had special powers. She began her career, I guess you would say, as a psychiatrist. She was trained in the analyst methods of Freud and Jung, but she progressed to more occult methods. And her collection of short stories, The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, which was published in 1926, is a really interesting example of where fiction and nonfiction occult experience crosses. So The Secrets of Dr. Taverner is ostensibly a fictional book about a man named Dr. Taverner who is kind of an occult detective. He's a physician, and he has an office in London where he'll see all sorts of patients. But if he has a patient that goes beyond a purely medical case into some sort of psychical situation, the person is a werewolf or a vampire, or they have some sort of creature chasing after them or something, he has a special hospital/nursing home in the country where he sends those people and he helps them. And Dr. Taverner is a member of multiple different societies, and he uses different magical signs and glyphs, as he calls them, to protect himself and to kind of fight with other people from other societies, for lack of a better term. And he has an assistant, almost like a Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson thing, Dr. Rhodes, who's been released from the military with shattered nerves. He joins Taverner's practice not knowing that there's supernatural aspects to it, and then starts to learn about this. And he ends up writing up all the cases of his adventures with Taverner as he sees more paranormal stuff happen. The fascinating thing about this is, yes, it's fiction, but she claimed that this was loosely based on her own mentor-mentee relationship with her occult trainer, a man named Moriarty. Yes, his name was Moriarty. Moriarty supposedly had been a Freemason at one point, but he was an Irish occultist and a physician who had been an officer in the medical service in India. And he ran an medical office in Hampshire at the end of World War I. And Fortune goes to meet with him because she was interested in how to help people whose psychological difficulties were baffling doctors, or maybe these people didn't respond to traditional treatment. And she claimed that Moriarty was using some of his occult powers to help people, and that he trained her to use her powers to contact the other side and to use these sorts of powers for good, I guess. The interesting thing is that this is not, the Dr. Taverner book is not something that just kind of pops out of nowhere. It's probably one of the few books that you could say is supposedly based on real life, but there was a whole genre of books around this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s that we call occult detective fiction, where it was men like Sherlock Holmes investigating mysteries, usually with a sidekick, yet the mysteries that they were investigating were possessions or any other sort of paranormal activity you can think of. And so these are writers like Sheridan Le Fanu and his detective/Dr. Martin Hesselius. Algernon Blackwood of horror fame wrote the John Silence stories. Ian H. Heron, a mother-son team, wrote the Flaxman Lowe stories. And you have W.H. Hodgson, who was a big influence on Lovecraft and wrote the House on the Borderland, which is a fantastic book. He wrote the series of stories about Carnacki, the ghost finder. And so Dr. Taverner in some ways plays right into that tradition, except supposedly it's nonfiction. And just one thing I want to add, we talked earlier about Ian Fleming trying to use Crowley to help him interrogate, someone from the other side in the war. During World War II, Fortune and the Inner Light group said that they were maintaining special otherworldly protections for the English coast. So they claimed that they were using magical protections to call guardian angels as sentries that would keep invaders out. And so, again, you have this kind of mixture, I guess, of the occult and the ordinary, fiction and just a wartime situation, that kind of trauma aspect to it.
Okay, Mel, I know everything you just said about guardian angels and Algernon Blackwood, and all that was probably well and good. But as soon as you started talking about Moriarty, all I'm thinking is, why do we not have this as a television show right now? Because this is basically like supernatural psychic Dr. House. And I mean, I don't know. I would watch that show.
Oh, I would watch it too.
I would binge watch it.
I mean, I'm just saying that I think that maybe if we approached, Amazon or Netflix with a TV show named Moriarty, put it out there as nonfiction, I think it would do well.
There you go. Yeah. I highly recommend checking out The Secrets of Dr. Taverner. It is something else.
Well, I think that's a really good place to kind of wrap up this episode, because we are going to talk a little bit more, speaking of psychic detectives in a future episode, we are going to really get into these societies that basically functioned as psychic detectives and were in many ways the forerunners to ghost hunters that we know so well today.
This is the No Fear Podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send us an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get special perks such as early access to our main episodes and exclusive mini-episodes released on the weeks in between our normal schedule, depending on the tier you choose. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.